So our first speaker is Joanna Zylinska. Did I get that right? Excellent. Okay. She is a professor of new media and communication at Goldsmiths in London, at the University of London. She is a scholar and a curator as well as a practicing photographer. And her work in these areas considers, among other things, the process of photographic mediation. And she does this by reflecting on photography's technical dimensions, among other things. That is how, as a technology or a technique, photography works through what she has eloquently called the relations between medium and matter. And that seems like a straightforwardly simple statement, but it's actually quite rich and redolent in what it evokes. Her publications include Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene, Life After New Media, Mediation as a Vital Process, written with Sarah Kember, and Bioethics in the Age of New Media. And all three of these publications offer an account of new media and technology, including biotechnology, as essentially dispersed within and constitutive of our biological and social lives. And all three of these publications prompt the reader to countenance and comprehend and also respond ethically to the novel relations among objects, entities, and phenomena, human and non-human alike, that constitute present-day existence. Other projects that I want to mention include Culture Machine, which is an international open access journal of culture and theory, and a partner project, which I just discovered, which is wonderful, the Photo Mediations Machine, which is an online artist space cum archive devoted to the subject of mediation in photography as well as other media. So please join me in welcoming Joanna today, whose talk is entitled Photography After the Human.
Thank you, Rachel, for such a generous introduction. And thank you also to Daniel for kind of concocting this gathering, and to Laura for organizing my visit. I'm really happy to be here. The main concern of my talk is the existence of images, and in particular, light-induced mechanical images known as photographs after the human. Now, the after the human designation doesn't just refer to the straightforward material disappearance or conceptual overcoming of the human as a result of climate change, say, but also to the present imaging of that disappearance as a prominent visual trope in art photography and other image practices. The concept of human extinction, the disappearance of the human, also opens up the question of the survival of art and the very meaningfulness of this conundrum in a world from which humans are gone. William Bornfield's 1996 science fiction novel, Time and Light, offers an interesting gateway for our discussion because it considers photography in a post-apocalyptic context while also interrogating photography's powers beyond its supposed ability to represent. The novel is set in an unspecified time in a 5-mile-long dome city of Fullerton, in which the last survivors of an undetermined nuclear disaster have reconstructed a semblance of the bourgeois society of yesteryear, with all its hierarchies and exclusions. Deemed the family of man, Fullerton's residents look like a bad copy of the characters depicted in Steichen's celebrated MoMA exhibition from 1955, whose aim was to showcase the commonalities amongst cross-cultural human experience, while also promoting the values of Pax Americana. The illuminated domed city of Fullerton is being powered by its invisible underbelly, an underground world full of deprived and dirty workers, very unlike those noble workmen and women from Steichen's images that also Roland Barthes wrote about in his mythologies, whose sole purpose in life is to provide fuel and energy for the smooth running of the city above. The post-industrialism of Fullerton is therefore being fed by the steam and manpower industrialism of a hidden world. Fullerton's society operates according to a number of prohibitions, the most prominent of which is an absolute ban on photography and other forms of imaging. The justification for this rule is as follows. It was decided a long time ago that a visual society was in a constant state of imbalance and agitation due to stress on the optic nerve and produced discord, especially harmful in the small controlled dome atmosphere. Therefore, visual paraphernalia was phased out and then totally eliminated. Now, the novel itself is constructed around 12 photographs, which serve as prompts for various developments in the narrative. The photographs, that we never see, arrive one day in the hands of the main protagonist, Dr. Noreen, who violates the societal expectations by not reporting his finding. Having seen traces of light, Noreen is pushed to commit further acts of insubordination, which include his descent to Fullerton's underbelly to shake the dome from the bottom up. At times bizarre in its imagery and less than convincing in its narrative, Bodneffel's book succeeds on a different level for me, in that it articulates a defense of the ontology of photography as a zoetic, life-transforming medium, one that can agitate and animate a different life, rather than just critique the present one, the way documentary photography does. Now, it's perhaps not too much of an overstatement to suggest that to understand a given society, we should look not just at the images it produces of itself, but also at its very relationship to photography and image making. Bornfeld seems to suggest that the survival of photography is vital to the survival of human society, because it is images that can give life back to an enclosed and paralyzed community, although in themselves, images don't carry any guarantee of a better world. This is a different story of photography from the more common Barthesian narrative outlined in Camera Lucida, where photography is inherently marked with death. Bornfeld highlights the fact that photography's powers are not just representational, regardless of whether we are talking about staged photographic practice, amateur snapshots, or even automatic recordings by unmanned camera placed in car parks, on drones, or in the Hubble Space Telescope. In each one of these, photography's power, I'd say, is first and foremost creative. It produces what we humans refer to as life by carving out an image from the flow of duration and stabilizing it in a certain medium. We could perhaps go so far as to say, and this is one of the key lines of argument of my paper, that photography is a quintessential practice of life. Photography records life, remembers life, or even creates it, bringing forth images, traces, and memories of the past, while also transforming the latter into a different, clearer, more stable vision of itself. According to the life-forming power of photography, attending to this life-forming power of photography, however, involves having to go beyond the established tradition of understanding perception and cognition in Western culture as agential processes controlled by the human, even if at times delegated to non-human automata. It also requires giving up on the molecular notion of the human, and indeed of photographs as outcomes of human production, for the sake of outlining instead what we might term a relational ontology of mediation, from which human and non-human photographers, photographs, and photography itself only emerge through temporary resolutions and cuts. As Sarah Kember and I have argued in Life After New Media, which clamors for the primacy of the notion of mediation, for understanding our human becoming with media and technology, it's precisely in its efforts to arrest duration, to capture or still the flow of life, beyond singular photographs' success or failure at representing this or that referent, that photography's vital forces are activated. This inherent likeness of photography animates the human, and this is very much indeed the vision outlined by Bornfeld. Now, the science fiction imaging and imaginings notwithstanding, there is another sense of this after the human designation, one that paves the ground for a more radical imagining of the abstraction of life and death in a temporal sense. I'm referring here to the recent proliferation in art, and especially in photography, of the practices of imaging and imagining a certain future after the human, from the viewpoint of the here and now. You can see this part of the talk as being a kind of follow-up to the exhibition on British landscapes as Satanic Mills is currently on at your museum here at Princeton. Variously referenced as ruin lust or ruin porn, such representations of the vanishing of the world as we know it by artists and the pleasurable wallowing by viewers in the images of decay that show the world as it soon will be, has some clear historical antecedents. Those stretch from the sublime romantic landscapes of ruined monuments by the likes of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, all the way through to paintings such as this one by Joseph Gandy, commissioned by John Soane, the architect of the Bank of England, and depicting the aforesaid bank as a ruin even before it was built. Yet the visual practice has gained a new inflection in a period in which issues of the global economic crisis, as well as climate change, have come to be experienced and articulated with an ever-increased intensity. We can think here of the haunting images of Detroit, a financially bankrupt city with a glorious industrial and architectural past, which widely proliferate on the internet. Many such accounts and images of the current global crisis, a crisis that extends beyond, even if never exceeds, the domain of finance to embrace areas such as healthcare, air quality, the climate, and politics itself, use the trope described by Ursula Heiser as the rhetoric of decline, interweaving elegy and tragedy not only to point to the decline, but also to signal anxiety about our present culture's narrative of modernization. Tate Britain's 2014 exhibition, Ruin Lust, inscribes itself in this very rhetoric. The exhibition was partly inspired by a 1953 book by Rose Macaulay titled Pleasure of Ruins, in which the author confronted the horrifying ruins to be widely encountered in the aftermath of World War II with a much more pleasant historical ruins upon which nature has exerted its softening touch, such as Pompeii or the Parthenon. The good ruins of the past had offered Macaulay a relief from the unbearable ruins that spoke of the recent atrocities. Relics depicted in the Ruin Lust Tate exhibition, from Turner's Tintern Abbey through to John Savage's photographic series, Uninhabited London, function as a mournful reminder of the passage of time, individual, historical, and cosmic. The exhibition was framed, both in its publicity and in the actual entrance space of the gallery, by a magisterial image by Jane and Louise Wilson, Asville, showing one of the many abandoned World War II coastal bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, defense fortification in Normandy. A black and white photograph, printed large to cover the whole of the wall facing the entrance to the exhibition space, it depicts a large building in a state of decay, which looks like a squatting giant, its black hole of the entryway resembling a gaping mouth. Shot with a large format camera, the image gains a visual tenderness due to the layer of vegetation covering the building's top, like some sort of incongruous thinning hair, or perhaps a hat on top of a giant head. Dismaying as this idea might seem, are we allowed to read this image as a depiction of a moment in time when the wartime ruin has moved beyond its sheer horror to enter Macaulay's space of the picturesque and the pleasant? To suggest this is not to diminish the trauma and distraction generated by World War II, only to point out that all sorts of catastrophic events eventually lend themselves to both monumentalization and aestheticization as a way of containing the shared trauma and moving on. And to follow this line of thought, if even the images of Nazi ruination or 9/11 distraction, as evidenced, for example, in Joel Meyerowitz's evocative book of photographs, Aftermath, World Trade Center Archive, are now becoming good ruins and entering the space of the picturesque, or at least the pictorial, what kinds of horrors do they stand in place of? What kind of apocalyptic event would then constitute their bad ruin counterpart? Are the good ruins of exhibitions and events, such as Tate Britain's Ruin Lust or the British Council's A Clockwork Jerusalem at the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale, actually attempts to confront and ward off the total ruination and annihilation of the earth, the human and life as we know it, in both economic and biological sense? We can indeed argue that it's precisely the urgency of the recent set of calamitous events in our global economic and ecological systems, dubbed an eco disaster by Tom Cohen, that has ushered in this new set of visualization codes and practices, perhaps in an attempt to hold off the political and ecological apocalypse by enclosing and framing it in a series of horrifying yet ultimately digestible images. Popular culture, especially mainstream film and TV, have of course been at the forefront of turning catastrophe into visual entertainment for many decades, classic movies such as Armageddon. Yet a new sense of total obliteration, without any notion of heroism or hope, is being ushered in by more recent productions, such as the History Channel's Life After People and HBO's The Leftovers. ecological cataclysms and the irreversible human-induced changes to our planet have also become a frequent aesthetic trope in art, and fine art photography in particular. We can think here of projects such as Andreas Gursky's monumental studies of commerce, global tourism, and the environment, his Dubai World, or the equally large-scale photographs arranged into series titled Oil, Australian Mines, and Water by Edward Burtynsky. These mainly desolate landscapes by Gursky and Burtynsky imagine a world in which the human is no more, although of course it's still a human artist that is performing both the imagining and the accompanying imaging. The after the human designation functions in their images predominantly as a certain aesthetic and visual trope. It references ruination and extinction as a particular art historical mode of representation and aestheticization. And like all historical tropes and trends, it's likely to pass long before the human has either solved the global economic or environmental crisis, or indeed has become extinct. Yet it may be worth dwelling in and on the ruins for a while, with a view to imagining what could perhaps be described as better ruination, not in the sense of Macaulay's picturesque, but rather in an attempt to reimagine our relation to the world just before the ruin, in the little time we have left. And this is precisely how Jason McGrath proposes to read the work of the Canadian-based photographer Tong Lam. Lam's 2013 book, Abandoned Futures, A Journey to the Post-Human World, and his exhibition Unreal Estate from the same year, depict derelict spaces in China, unfinished and abandoned theme parks, shopping malls, and housing projects, now overgrown by vegetation. McGrath reads Lam's images as an exposition of the failure of the mentality of limitless growth. The coupling of the crisis of the American-Chinese dream of unrestrained consumerism and the human's abode being unable to sustain that dream also serves as a reminder of the deep time that encapsulates and exceeds the temporality of our human existence as both individuals and species. According to McGrath, the post-human gaze at modernist ruins reminds us that no matter how many new objects we produce, consume, and discard, those objects will, in many cases, far outlive us and the purpose to which we put them. The fake sphinx may go underappreciated by any human observer, but its head will continue to make a fine perch for a bird. The look at human history from the perspective of cosmic time needn't be seen as a sign of political quietism or planetary scale existentialist paralysis, but it can introduce a certain humility into our political frameworks, from which a new image of the world and of ourselves in this world can emerge. So this mode of reimagining the known is not restricted to popular culture or to fine art. The subcultural practice of urban exploration, and as investigated in Bradley Garrett's 2013 heavily illustrated book, Explore Everything, Place Hacking the City, relies on photography to not just document the visited ruins, but also depict the after the human landscape, which for now remains obscured from public view, but which offers a chilling premonition of things to come. Residing in the ruin, or even the construction site, writes Garrett, triggers affective associations, leading to a crisis of memory as one realizes that everything is always being lost. The reliance on photography, then, is an effort to capture not that transition, but the experience of being present in the flow of time. Garrett's statement can help us comprehend a unique role that photography, as a device capable of stopping time and conjuring things out of it, plays in the human engagement with ruination. The philosopher of duration Henri Bergson claims that we do not think real time, but we live it because life transcends intellect. Time can't be grasped then, be it with a camera or intellect, because to capture time truly would mean to stop it. Instead, time can only be experienced and enacted repeatedly. The imaging process presents itself as primary and ontological here. We could go so far as to say that it is only through photography that the world becomes something for us, and then does it over and over again. We could then ask, together with anthropologist Tim Ingold, could it be that images do not stand for things, but rather help you find them? This idea can be traced back to Bergson's Matter and Memory, in which he claims that our experience of the world, which is always a way of sensing the world, already comes in the form of images. To put this another way, The creative impulse of life takes it beyond representation as a form of picturing what already exists. Instead, life is a creation of images in the most radical sense, a way of temporarily stabilizing matter into forms. Photographic practice, as we conventionally know it, is just one instantiation of this creative process of life. If after Bergson, time or duration equals creative evolution and hence life itself, we are once again presented here with a vision of photography as effectively enacting and allowing one to sense rather than just represent what I call lifeness. It may seem paradoxical that it's by photographing something as lifeless as ruination and decay that the practice of photography is able to create this life-enhancing sensation. Yet it's not only by sensing life, but also by being able to envisage its alternative arrangements that the photographic trope of ruination can lend itself to a planned world-making purpose, also known as politics. As Garrett suggests, drawing on Susan Bax-Morse's account of Benjamin's The Arcade Project, the image of the ruin is emblematic not only of the fragility of capitalism, but also of its inevitable destruction. As people become more curious about what a post-capitalist world would look like, urban explorers can supply imaginative depictions. These combined spatio-temporal senses of the after the human designation addressed here arrange themselves into an articulation of a particular visual sensibility. They also outline an ethico-political responsibility, whereby visualization becomes a way of engaging with a political and existential problem of great magnitude, even if it doesn't yet offer any specific solutions. Yet it's precisely here that art and photography have the potential to become truly ethical, rather than just moral or worse, moralistic, as they can depict this human-non-human relationality qua responsibility. This line of thought develops from my recent book, Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene, the aim of which was to think seriously about human and non-human extinction, and about the kinds of ethics and politics that are ushered in by the horizon of extinction. The Anthropocene here becomes a thought device that helps us to visualize and intervene in the timeline of the extinction of various species. And it should be mentioned, and it was mentioned indeed yesterday, that questions have been raised with regard to the supposed political conservatism of the concept of the Anthropocene, which seemingly apportions blame to this nebulous entity called the human, without providing a more detailed account of the inequalities of power and capital involved in our having an impact upon the planet. Obviously, not all humans, or even groups of humans, have exerted the same amount of agency in enacting these changes. Just as global derivatives traders have contributed more to the economic crisis than, say, subprime mortgage buyers, international oil petroleum companies contributed more to the eco-pollution of the Niger Delta than local farmers. As indicated by Etienne Turpin, the Anthropocene is a kind of grand leveler because it implicates all humanity equally in the production of a geophysical stratigraphy that is and has been asymmetrically produced according to divisions of class, race, gender, and ability. We could see this statement as pointing to an inherent element of justice that such a deep time perspective entails. In the Anthropocene framework, even the rich and powerful can't escape extinction. At the risk of sounding flippant, I want to suggest that to bring this framework to bear on global capitalism is the only way to show definitively that this particular systemic arrangement will inevitably die out. No matter where one stands politically, the concept of the Anthropocene can become a powerful tool in shaking up politics as we know it, across the whole political spectrum. This is because, as many scientists have pointed out, by highlighting the increase in the Earth's temperatures, the rise of ocean levels, and the depletion of fossil fuels, carrying on as before is no longer an option. The Anthropocene thesis is thus almost a perfect antidote to the politics of the status quo. It's also the first science-backed account of the death of the post-industrial capitalism of the globalized world, as well as of that world. This is not to suggest that we should all therefore just sit back and wait for extinction to happen, or to extinguish all hope for material and political change in the near term, contemplating the ruin porn while wallowing in our own transience. Still, extending the temporal scale beyond that of human history by introducing the horizon of extinction can be an important first step in visualizing a post-neoliberal world here and now. even if further steps will require us to shorten the scale again. So I want to suggest that photography is uniquely placed when it comes to exercising what might be termed the geological sensibility and reimagining the eco disaster. There are two reasons for this. First, the activity and presence of light as an enabler and enforcer of temporary stabilization and as a marker of the passage of time offers a different perspective on the problems of extinction, climate change, and the depletion of natural resources. As discussed earlier, photography allows us to apprehend time as duration precisely by making incisions in its flow. It gives us a concept of the flow while also enacting incisions in it. We could indeed suggest that photography becomes a supplement to process philosophy in that it foregrounds moments when things stabilize, when they become things. Even though these moments of stabilization are temporary and impermanent, no matter whether they are enacted on a mirror-like surface of metallic silver, paper covered with silver halide, or a CCD sensor, they scale down the deep time of non-human history to the human measure of duration and perception, while also reconnecting us to a temporal flow of matter and energy. Photography thus becomes a device for us to look at the world, a world we are constantly making and unmaking. Significantly, light doesn't just represent change in the world, but also becomes a carrier of that change. Think here, for example, about Nadav Kander's photographic series Dust, which captures the radioactive ruins of secret cities on the border of Kazakhstan and Russia. These landscapes of invisible dangers feature dilapidated or collapsing buildings with overgrown shards of concrete arranging themselves into absurd apocalyptic sculptures. Enveloped in pinkish-bluish haze and glow, the cities of Priozersk and Kokhatov are an inversion of Bornfeld's Fullerton. Strangely encysted in domes made from beautifully dispersed light, they contain radiation, contamination, and ruination. We need to remember that light is always coupled with dust, cloud, rain, and other elements, and it is in this very coupling that it becomes visible to us humans. There is also another sense in which photography yields itself particularly well to zooming in on the after the human perspective, which has to do with its inherently non-human ontology. Indeed, I suggest that a human-driven practice, conventionally known as photography, is part of a wider photographic condition. Photography has always been non-human. It's part of a bigger argument that I'm developing at the moment somewhere else, because it has been shaped by what Willem Flusser has identified as the photographic apparatus that supposedly lies in wait for photography, and that leaves an algorithmic mark on it, one executed by the machine, the cultural conventions of photographic representation, or human photographers' DNA. This non-human trace is not decisive. This is to say, it doesn't determine what images will or will not be taken, or whether they will be taken at all. But it does affect the so-called nature of both photographic technique and photographic practice. The photographic condition, whose existence I postulate, refers to various living and non-living things, such as, say, satellites in the sky or cells in our body, participating in the process of imaging across many levels and scales. According to biologist Lynn Margulis, the principal characteristic of all living organisms is their ability to perceive, that is, to recognize and make an image of something. Imaging is therefore positioned not just by Margulis, but also by many philosophers and proto-philosophers of post-anthropocentric thought, such as Bergson, Deleuze, and Guattari, as well as Claire Colebrook, as a fundamentally creative process of life. Seen in this light, photography can be said to be ontological or world-making, establishing as it does what I've termed the photographic condition, which exceeds human photographic practices. It's in this dual proposition that since its very inception, photography has always been non-human, and that the human-driven practice conventionally known as photography is part of a wider photographic condition that underpins my effort to think photography after the human, that is beyond its traditional humanism and human-centrism. Therefore, rather than understand the photographic projects under discussion in this talk, or indeed any other photographic works, as complete photographs to be inspected and interpreted, we should think of them as nodes in a matrix of trails to be followed by observant eyes, as Ingalls has it. Through this, we are introduced to a different mode of understanding artistic practice, beyond the split between viewer and image, mind and world, and into a dynamic and ongoing movement of interactions. That movement, according to Ingold, is nothing less than life itself, and is the impulse of life that gives rise to the forms we see. If all life is imagistic or photographic, we don't actually need photography to enact it for us. Yet photography in its various guises, both amateur and artistic, is particularly well placed to bring this image-making condition of life home. Looking at the photographs that imagine the world after the human, as discussed in this talk, but arguably looking at any other less apocalyptic photographs, we cannot help but imagine these scenes as eventually having no human observer at all, writes Jason McGrath. Rather than a modern subject apprehending such objects, there will be only the objects themselves, prehending one another. In spite of my earlier reservation, I therefore seem to have returned here to Barth's argument in Camera Lucida, in which photographs of other humans serve as reminders of their inevitable death. Seen in the Anthropocene framework, photography reminds us of the passage of time across larger scales. It brings home the fact that there will be a time not just after the life of our mother, say, but also after the life of any other human on Earth. Yet in a twist to Barth's argument, photography also incises time to bring forth things here and now. It therefore both makes life and can make life better. So, wrapping up, how can we reimagine and reinvent life and death beyond representationalism to imagine the Anthropocene better and to develop a better response to it? American artist Trevor Paglen poses similar questions by way of framing his project, The Last Pictures from 2012. Citing biologist Susan Oyama, Paglen wonders how we can envisage and capture the abstraction that is ecological collapse, given that the things that most threaten us are those for which there are no images. The Last Pictures, developed in collaboration with engineers and scientists from MIT, involve sending into space a golden disk etched with 100 images indicative of our humanity. Attached to the communications satellite, the disk became a future alien artifact. For Paglen, the project is not a grand representation of humanity or a portrait of life on Earth, but rather a collection designed to transcend the Anthropocene and to transcend deep time itself. A collection of pictures designed for the time of the cosmos. Paglen knows the chances that some future civilization will find the artifacts are almost nil. However, the point of the Last Pictures is not to convey something as complex and simultaneously abstract as humanity, even though the history of photography and the history of space travel are full of examples of similar misguided ambitions, from the aforementioned exhibition Family of Man to Carl Sagan's collection of images sent with the Voyager mission was the picture for, the idea for the aliens. They could see what we looked like, what we did. For Paglen, the gesture is more meaningful than any future act of interstellar deciphering, because the very idea of meaning itself breaks down in the vastness of time. Nothing manifests the abstract scales of time as poignantly as a plastic cup, which is meant to be sipped for a few minutes, but its styrofoam takes more than 1 million years to biodegrade. It's something that Timothy Morton called a hyperobject. Alongside the photograph of the fake Sphinx from Tong Lam's photographs, underappreciated by any human observer, even though its head will continue to make a fine perch for a bird, the image of the styrofoam cup serves as a time machine for us humans, one that not only helps us imagine ourselves gone, but also to see our own limitations of our own this worldly horizon and perspective. Photography after the human, understood in the multiple senses engaged in this talk, mustn't therefore be seen as a pointless intellectual or artistic exercise. It's rather an important ontological and ethical task, as it can help us create here and now a vision of a world which is not human, that is, which is not of and for the human. Built upon the abstraction of our human death and eventual extinction, a world picture of this kind shatters the traditional images of this world, along with those representational practices that have driven the humanist and human-centric tradition of photography and image making. The introduction of the non-human perspective will allow us to reorient our embodied human eye that is stuck in its own present spectacle by cutting the flow of time and speculating about the flow's future direction. In liberating vision from the constraints of the embodied human eye with its established set of visual relations and the limited directionality of its outlook, a possibility arises of glimpsing another setup. The seemingly minimal intervention, when compared, for example, with direct action or political engagement, can actually have earth-shattering consequences because it plants in our human minds a radically different set of images and imaging practices, one that transcends the subjectivism of the human eye. Unseeing ourselves and what we are calling the world in this way, abstract as it may sound, must be a first step in any kind of concrete and responsible reconfiguration of our here and now. Could I take another couple of minutes just to, there's a sound, I think, I've run out of time. Can I take another couple of minutes? As a coda, I wanted to show you this visual project, which is, it could be described, yes. No. Thanks. It's a visual project I'm working on. It's a kind of book. I'm playing with a few titles. One is the End of Man, a local history project. It could also be subtitled a kind of tribute to Catherine Yusuf, because it's an attempt to kind of Kathmanticize. And it's kind of working with photographic images. About 70% are mine, 10% are taken from other artists, and 20% from different photographic archives. And the idea is to, alongside the kind of philosophical work I do, is to publish as a picture book. I'm just going to quickly, as a way of, just scroll.
You have to just go down. Down.
Use the arrows up there.
Just move it later.
Okay. No, the arrows aren't working. That's the problem.
Yeah, the arrows in this one is not working.
Okay. Okay. Well, quickly, just thank you. I'll just whiz you through it. So. Okay, these are working. Anyway, so these are. So just a rough cut. It look very differently. But another subtitle is, say, a local history of the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Okay, so while we're making the tech shift, I'll introduce Robin Kelsey, who is the Shirley Carter Burden Professor of Photography in the Department of Art and Architecture at Harvard. And Robin specializes in the history of photography and American art, but I should say that the range of his teaching and research is much, much broader than those descriptive categories might suggest. His book, Archive Style, Photographs and Illustrations for U.S. Surveys, 1850 to 1890, which was 2007, is that correct? Considered the predicament of photography within the context of government-sponsored geographical surveys in the West, and looked at a series of extraordinary photographs produced within rather unextraordinary circumstances, the context of bureaucracy and scientific / geological surveys and tried to account for their extraordinariness. As with his most recent book, Photography and the Art of Chance, which came out last year, is that correct? Yes, which explores the double-edged sword of chance in photographic practices. Along with this book, Archive Style offers at once a new history and a new theory of the nature and capacity of the photographic. Along with his writing on picture theory, the idea of landscape, wartime photography, which actually offers an interesting connection. His work on wartime photography offers an interesting connection to the ruin lust about which Joanna spoke. Along with these things, his writing about photographic practice among other media in the art of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the intersection of art and law, and the relationship between ecology and historical interpretation. All of Robin's work has made him an essential voice for scholars and students of multiple disciplines. And now it's time for full disclosure. I am lucky enough to count Robin as a contributor to 2 books that I have edited. The first, co-edited with James Elkins, Landscape Theory. The second, Picturing, which just came out, that puts together a set of essays about not the meaning of pictures, but the problems picturing as a thing represents, and also the very possibility of picturing as produced by various conceptual and historical conditions. The other way of saying this is that pictures are things that people can and choose to do, and the book is curious about that, and Robin's essay on pictorialism as theory offers a really essential intervention into that set of questions. So I was fortunate to have him as a collaborator, and we are also lucky to have him here speaking to us today. And his title is an easy one to remember and to say. It's Inversion. Please join me in welcoming Robin Kelsey.
Thank you, Rachel. That was one of those introductions where I'm like, boy, this guy's great. I can't wait to hear him. And then, really? That's me. Okay. But thank you, Rachel, for that. And thank you, Daniel, for inviting me to this event, which I'm finding incredibly stimulating. And for Laura for all her, I don't know where she is, logistical help in bringing this off. My talk has 4 brisk parts, and the first one riffs a bit on issues that came up yesterday evening. I tend to enjoy these events much more when they become dialogic and responsive, so I'm going to try to do a bit of that. The second one meditates a bit on the history of the spectacular image, and I thought I would tackle what do we mean by the spectacular image, so I'll be doing a little bit of that. The third takes up a contemporary work by the artist Greg Stimac called Inversion, gives my talk its title. And the fourth returns to the history of the spectacular image to complicate both it and my interpretation of Stimac's work. Okay, part 1, the riffs. A few basic points about photography as an innovation that might set the stage for further conversation. The first point is about self-representation. The phrase toward which much of the discussion became focused last night was this we are nature defending itself, and I thought that the pressure applied to that phrase concerning the limits that define it as meaningful, either politically or semiotically, I thought was interesting and fruitful. And the notion of giving nature a new agency historically is very much tied to the emergence of photography. In 1839, following the announcement of the invention of photography, first in France and then in England, the publisher William Blackwood issued an article claiming, quote, "All nature shall paint herself," right? So we have nature defending itself, but here with photography we have all nature painting itself. Fields, rivers, trees, houses, plains, mountains, cities shall all paint themselves at a bidding and at a few moments' notice. Towns will no longer have any representatives but selves. Invention says it. It has found out the one thing new under the sun, that by virtue of the sun's patent, all nature, animate and inanimate, shall be henceforth its own painter, engraver, printer, and publisher. here is a revolution in art. All right. And this language of self-representation is, of course, saturated with politics in 1839, right? The notion that towns will no longer have representatives but selves, right, has actual great political currency, because there's a great concern of how do you represent these different political subdivisions in larger legislative bodies, and lots of problems of representation are coming up. So photography is heralded as this invention that's going to enable everyone and everything to represent itself. All right, and in a famous journal entry of 1841, Ralph Waldo Emerson called photography the daguerreotype, the true Republican style of painting. The artist stands aside and lets you paint yourself. And the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, as you may know, takes this up and calls Daguerre the greatest inventor, discoverer of the 19th century, because he'd found this way for people to represent themselves, right? And he says that, you know, African Americans could not be represented fairly by Euro-American artists because of their racial bias, but photography had cut through that. Now, the history of photography and the encoding of racial bias in it with light meters and so forth is a very complicated subject. But the important point here, I think, is that there is this germ within photography, this promise of self-representation. And this does extend beyond the human. And I show you Daguerre's daguerreotype, pretty famous daguerreotype of fossil shells, right? Because this analogy between fossils and photographs is often made, right? In some sense, fossils are self-representations in the manner of photographs. And it's worth considering, especially in light of what Joanna was saying about the notion of photography as, in some ways, being a life-giving process, as opposed to Barth's notion of, you know, a kind of memoriam, that the word reproduction, when it started to be used for photographs, was actually drawn from biology. That reproduction was not a term that was used in industrial production. Reproduction was used as a term to describe what happens when you lop off one of the limbs of a starfish and it would regrow another one. So this notion that the things before the camera were growing themselves into the photographic plate, right, is something that it's really important, I think, to reconstruct if we're going to understand how photography was received in the world. The second point is the agency of time. It was brought up last night, this rift between the great expanse of geologic time and that sense of temporal urgency around climate change. And I think this discussion could remind us that in some sense, historically, the collapse and expansion of time emerged simultaneously in the early 19th century. And of course, I'm thinking about, on the one hand, the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, the steam mills, the acceleration of time, which is destabilizing even in the 19th century. And sometimes if you want to be reassured that people always found modernity destabilizing, it's good to reread something like The Education of Henry Adams, where he says, you know, after the Civil War, that everything he had learned in college is useless now because the world's changing so fast. And one is reminded that as one has to update one's devices, one is engaging in a long-standing conundrum of modernity. So on the one hand, you have the Industrial Revolution and the kind of acceleration of time, and of course, you have Lyell and, you know, stratification and the new geology, Lyell's Principles of Geology coming out in the early 1830s, right, and that tremendous expansion of time. And in this regard, you know, it's interesting, I was thinking as Joanna talked about Thomas Cole's Course of Empire, which is a common touchstone. I don't have a reproduction of it in my PowerPoint, but also coming in the 1830s, 1836, this notion of a concern for what Marx regarded as that metabolic rift between an industrial society on the one hand and the metabolism of geology and nature on the other, and trying to contend with that rift. And actually, if you remember the Course of Empire, it ends with birds nesting on a ruined column, right, much as that bird was on the Sphinx head, right? And that, you know, there's some ecological accuracy to that, the way the birds recolonized devastated areas before many other large forms of biota. So it is, I think, important to recognize that photography arrives in the world pretty much at the same moment as geologic time. I think it's really quite significant. So on the one hand, you have this notion that the Earth had shaped itself without design, right? That it's good to reconstruct that mind-blowing moment in the early 19th century, that you have an Earth that shaped itself without design through this incremental action of earthly forces. And on the other hand, you have this technology that allows nature to paint itself, right? So there's this kind of automatism, right, that has taken hold in nature, right? So instead of having God as designer, you have this strange incremental action. And now you have pictures that instead of being designed by a designer, right, by a hand, right, that they are emerging through the incremental action of light. And of course, there's a threatening displacement of agency in both cases, right? The eradication of God, the threatened eradication of God on the one hand, and the threatened eradication of the artist on the other. The artist, since the Renaissance, in Europe at least, trying to be a creator in the model of the divine, going back to Michelangelo and Raphael and so forth. So I think it's important to think about the historical roots of this crisis of agency, which I think was looming over some of the discussion last night. And this photograph, I think, can also remind us of the extent to which photography was regarded as a kind of elemental process, right? It required silver, right? One experimenter, Sir John Herschel, went out and got vegetable dyes made from his garden to produce photographic prints. And to understand photography as it emerged in the 19th century really requires remembering that it was not this industrial process where you didn't see inside the box or whatever. You were actually using these elemental chemicals, and it was understood as a form of natural magic. So I think that's worth recalling. I also want to say a couple things just about photography and atmosphere, right? There is a sense in which you can write a history of modernity as a relationship between surfaces and vapors, right? Between our screens and our cloud, right? I mean, it's still, the metaphors we're using now of screen and cloud go a long way back, right? And I love this. This is a lantern slide in the George Eastman House produced by Alfred Stieglitz in 1892-93. This is actually asphalt paving. Asphalt had been developed in 1860s by a Columbia chemist, but it wasn't used because people didn't think it was really necessary, but it was actually the invention of the bicycle, the safety bicycle, that created this demand for better surfaces. And so what Stieglitz does is he goes out with a handheld camera, one new mobile technology that had just come out, and he's taking photographs of the alchemical transformation of the urban spaces in order to make way for a new form, another form of mobility, that is the bicycle. And cameras and bicycles in this moment are deeply linked, and there's a lot of companies that produce both, right, as though that's a kind of natural thing. But one of the things to bear in mind is the way in the 19th century that vapor is so important for aesthetic value in ambitious photography, right? The pictorialism is so much about atmosphere and vapor, and of course photography as a process is so caught up in atmosphere and vapor. And if you read photographic manuals in professional journals in the 19th century, so much it's about the level of humidity and taking photographs in this climate versus that climate and so forth. And so it's interesting that on the one hand, vapor is still that romantic symbol of the ineffable, that which cannot be comprehended, whose formlessness is sort of always beyond us. And on the other hand, this is the moment of Maxwell and his kinetic theory of gases and the way in which science is starting to govern even the ungovernable. And finally, in terms of these riffs on last night, photography and the unseen, I think it's really important with photography to remember that for most of its history, it bore the promise not just of showing you what you could see, but what you couldn't see, right? And that came in a lot of different ways. And I'm giving you examples. Spirit photography, this is a Mummler photograph, supposedly a spirit image, of course, fraudulent. And then, but interesting. And then motion photography. This is one of the cyanotype studies of Muybridge, right, where people were seeing the configuration of the horse's body in motion in a way they never had before. X-ray photography didn't seem like a completely different thing from ordinary photography, but actually kind of an extension of it, one that was anticipated from the very outset of photography by the most prescient, including William Henry Fox Talbot. And then the notion that in sort of muckraking photography, that photography was going to penetrate the walls of the factory, the walls of the tenement houses, and deliver an unseen social world. And so, in some sense, I would say the struggle that photography is having with representing the invisibility of climate change, right, is actually a kind of crisis for photography. Because in many ways, it has, in the past, been credited with delivering the invisible. And there's a whole history of the struggle with what does photography do with the invisible or the counterfactual? How do you supplement photography? And just to give you one example, which will lead into what I'm going to get to next. This is a 1955 publication from the Sierra Club. It's a landmark publication. It's when David Brower is turning the club into a national lobbying organization when it was really just a statewide sort of recreational club. He's trying to save Dinosaur National Monument. They're talking about putting in a dam and flooding it, and it's probably hard to see in this size, but over this photograph, there are dotted lines indicating with the low water line and the high water line of where the water was going to flood this place. So the Sierra Club, which as I'll go into in a moment, which becomes known for the photograph kind of delivering nature in all its plenitude and self-sufficiency, actually at the outset is struggling with something we're struggling with now, is how do you use photography to represent something that may not be immediately visible, some kind of threat that may not be immediately visible. And I think it's really good to remember this history in this moment. Right? Okay, part two, the legacy of the spectacular image. I was struck by the evocative beginning to the title for this conference, After the Spectacular Image, and I sort of wondered what that meant to all these different people and different disciplines. So I thought I would venture the sort of thing that I think of in relationship to environmental issues when I think of the spectacular image. And this is, in many ways, a very unremarkable kind of image by Larry Ulrich of Mount Rainier that graced the month of May in the 1994 Sierra Club Wilderness Calendar. And it's a photograph that exemplifies an enduring wilderness aesthetic associated with 20th century environmentalism. And I think sort of intellectually we all sort of feel like we're beyond this, but I think it's really worth remembering that most people are not, right? And I don't mean to set this up in a too condescending kind of way. I just mean to say, I go out and talk to people and I say, what do you think of as like, how the environment is represented? What is a landscape photograph? And this stuff is still so dominant, right? And I think it's worth thinking about it. The history of this aesthetic is something that Finis Dunaway and others, including me, have written quite a bit about. But for brevity's sake, I'm going to reduce it to a really schematic kind of formula, which wouldn't hold up under a lot of pressure, but maybe some. And that is Ansel Adams. In the late 1920s, he develops a black and white landscape style that becomes the most famous landscape style in American photography. And he is deeply involved in the Sierra Club, not just as someone who provides photographs, but in the management and direction of the club. And in 1960, the club starts really investing itself in photography with the exhibit format books. The first one has this, really ghastly Cold War title, This is the American Earth. It's really kind of amazing. Anyway, and it's illustrated with Adams' photographs such as this one. And then the fourth book in the series, which comes out only a couple years later, 1962, but these two are the most popular. This is the American Earth, and this one, Wildness is the Preservation of the World. This is Elliot Porter, right, who pioneers a counterpoint style, right, which uses, whereas Ansel Adams does these operatic Western landscapes in this, these beautifully controlled, meticulously controlled grayscales. Porter goes into color, right, which color is associated with commercial photography, so it's kind of a tricky business moving into color, and there's a lot of stewing at the Sierra Club about how good the printing has to be and so forth. And instead of doing the western landscapes, he does the intimate woodland scenes in the east. And there's sort of a kind of combination of their styles that becomes the Sierra Club photographic aesthetic, right? Which appears not only in some books, but it really gets going. It's interesting that the calendars are actually produced as a way to raise money to allow them to publish more books, but the calendars become wildly successful. And you can still, buy them at the few remaining bookstores in America. And so, eventually you get something like this. And the endurance of this style, again, is just remarkable, right? Notions of ecology change dramatically in all this, but this style, right? This style continues to be used. All right. So, and here's two examples more of Sierra Club calendars. Wait, did I skip one? Oh no, I guess that's it. Okay. And the board of directors of the Sierra Club would refer to this stuff as propaganda. They were really, it's interesting. I've gone through the archives of the Sierra Club out at the Bancroft Library, and they're quite bald about it. Like a member of the board called In Wildness General Nature Propaganda, and a sales manager of Sierra Club Books objected to a possible price increase by saying, "I am certain I do not have to point out to you the club's obligation to see the greatest number of books sold because of their propagandistic function," right? And they were widely admired because this use of photography was credited with this vast expansion of the club and it becoming the premier national environmental organization. In fact, one writer for the Collector's Quarterly Report said, quote, "Fresh from the perusal of club books like Ansel Adams' Photographs of American Parklands or Elliot Porter's Record of the Changing Seasons, almost any responsible citizen can be looked upon as a potential vigilante in the protection of the American wilderness." All right, so then scores of photographers continue to work in this mode, submitting things to the Sierra Club. And there's certain distinctive things about this style, right, that we can note, right? There are no signs of people or signs of civilization. I mean, I was thinking about this when Joanna was talking about these apocalyptic images, right? But there's something that's in inhuman photography here, actually, right? There's a complete suppression of signs of civilization, of history, even old mining camps or burial mounds. You don't see them. There are very few signs of animal life. It's almost exclusively a mineral and vegetable domain, so maybe broader extinction. There are occasionally charismatic megafauna, but there are usually no other signs of animal life, right? There's no signs of disease or defecation or violence or territorial hostility, right? No droppings, broken eggs, whatever. No carnivorous consumption is ever allowed, right? Even though most wildlife, when it is shown, is a carnivore, right? So bears, they can eat fish occasionally, but pescatarian, that's the limit, right? And only the cleanest and best looking of animal representatives are ever shown. No scruffy or muddy birds, elk with broken antlers, mountain lions with skin conditions. They cannot not apply. And I love these examples, right? This is 1989, this is 1993. These are the same eagles in the same tree, right? So this is one photographer who got a great, up in Alaska, got a great tree worth of eagles. Sierra Club decided they loved it, so 4 years later they just used another one. All right. Another thing about these landscapes is that they appear as though they have an organic desire to make themselves available to our gaze, right? The beautiful plenitude of the scene is always unobstructed, right? It is nature there for us. Another quality is that tranquility reigns, right? The calendar landscape is by and large anti-motion photography. Everything is clear and fixed and still, right? No blurred branches or pouring rain or white caps on any lakes. However, transient, the effects of light, or conspicuous, the signs of the changing seasons, the moment seems eternal, right? Photographs are turning us to a kind of Eden. The landscape also shows no signs of work or material limitation. The photograph itself is always technically flawless and erases all signs of production. Indeed, the penchant in this kind of photography is to show photography itself as a kind of natural process, the world reproducing itself in images, right? Reflections are keenly desired in this aesthetic, nature making itself into a photograph. And in these many ways, right, the calendar photograph, and this is one thing I love about these calendars, is it completely contradicts the calendar itself, right? These two things could not be more opposed, right, to one another, right? It's, you know, the picture suppresses the linear, irreversible passage from day to day with its temporal demands and material limitations, its artificiality and reproductive hardship, right? And so this image becomes a kind of antidote to ordinary life, right? It's a kind of restorative image that it appears above this grid of quotidian obligations, right? Judy's dental appointment, 3 p.m., Carl's recital, birthdays, graduations, right? In fact, if you could see closely, my name appears on this is my parents' calendar. So rising above the monotonous geometry and mundane scribbling, the gorgeous views offer the sanctuary apart, right? This beckoning reconciliation of the eternal and the momentary, right? And of course, this went to a certain population, overwhelmingly white and generally speaking quite well off. And Martin Berger, among others, has argued that the domes and spires of the West and so forth were very much coated with Christian whiteness. Okay, so that's my thinking a little bit about the spectacular image. So this is the third part. This is Greg Stimack's Old Faithful inversion. In 2012, the artist Greg Stimack produced two versions of a work entitled Old Faithful inversion. One was a digital video loop, and the other was a 16 millimeter film made on the basis of it. I was hoping to. All right, so I'm just going to show this to you. You can watch it while I talk. In an interview, Stimack describes the development of this work as follows. Quote, in December of 2011, I was planning a trip to take my own recording of Old Faithful, but learned that the park was closed for the winter season. Rather than wait for the snow to melt, I took an 8-second clip from someone's vacation footage from the web. I decided to make this footage my own. Through a series of editing dissolves and put on a loop, Old Faithful was now able to ceaselessly flow at full capacity. After I inverted the color, the geyser was unrecognizable, so much so that I felt the need to include the name in the title. Moving from positive to negative, the geyser appeared more like an oil gusher than a national natural wonder. So in a world of 24/7 access, Stimack finds the wait for the seasonal opening of Yellowstone intolerable, perhaps concluding that the tourist practice of making photographs or videos that replicate readily available and superior depictions of the same subject is a curious habit anyways, which I've always thought it was. He instead grabs footage from the web. And this formula, by the way, has a counterpart with my own relationship to the work, because Stimack actually installed this work in Chicago at the corner of I've forgotten. Some street corner, Michigan and, anyway, I don't remember. Randolph in Michigan, in Chicago. It's part of a Museum of Contemporary Photography show, and I wanted to get to Chicago, and I couldn't make it, so I just grabbed it off the web. I didn't get to the loop to see it, so I just took the loop from the web. Okay. So Stimack brings the logic of 24/7 access to the imagery itself. Instead of depicting Old Faithful erupting, subsiding, and dormant, he offers it as a continuous flow, always at full capacity, a stream of stuff as relentless as the image stream of the web from which he took the clip. And then he claims that the color inversion renders it unrecognizable. Now, the work operates in several ways as an inversion of the spectacular image as I've sketched it out, right? The plenitude of the spectacular image, its munificent natural bounty, its spiritual reserve becomes more like wasteful expenditure. The scenic resources of abundant nature become more like the natural resources of a profligate economy. Conservation becomes more like extraction. Untrammeled uniqueness becomes more like industrial repetition. And I show you these wonderful Old Faithful candy bars you can get in the gift shop when you go there. I didn't make it to Chicago, but I made it to Old Faithful. Okay. And the delicate negotiation in the spectacular image between modernist distillation and colorful enchantment becomes more like a dystopian combination of bluish hoarfrost, rust-colored smog, and black turbulence. And the temporality of the spectacular image, which welds transience to eternity, becomes more like an entrapped monotony. The rhythms of the days and the seasons becomes more like an endless outlay of the same. The loop, in some sense, I think, partakes of what one might call, with acknowledgement of Rob Nixon, the slow violence of time, but also the uncanny disturbance of eliding it, right? And the suppression of signs of economic life in the spectacular image becomes more like an acknowledgement, right? The Sierra Club images systematically hid the economy of wilderness recreation, an economy of gasoline-powered vehicles traveling to trailheads, of oil-based synthetic parkas and tents, which even some of activists may be using, of lobbying efforts fueled with industrial profits. Old Faithful inversion seems to signify this economy, to acknowledge the entwinement of ethereal spray and oily splatter. And this acknowledgement extends to the production of the imagery itself, right? The sickly palette and clone sequencing of the loop, let alone its coloristic inversion, declare its artifice. I also think the video loop, to a certain extent, loosens the suppression of history of the spectacular image. The evocation of the oil gusher is not simply an acknowledgement of fossil fuels and their current economic entanglement with natural park recreation, but also a reminder of the history of the West and its exploitation. The rapacious pursuit of new frontiers of development, the forced exodus of American Indians from mineral-rich lands, and the setting aside of lands for recreational use only when the government was assured they were otherwise of limited value. So this could be our story then. Old Faithful inversion as a corrective, as a more honest representation. Like a splash of cold water on a person dreaming, it might help to awaken us from the illusions of the spectacular image to face the sobering realities attending the American landscape. Part 4. But my account of Greg Stimack's Old Faithful inversion has its problems. To begin with, it turns out that the inversion of Old Faithful to make it resemble a gushing oil well was actually practiced by none other than Ansel Adams himself. Around 1942, Adams made several such photographs which were widely reproduced and circulated. And although I am by no means suggesting that an inversion such as this is the same as that produced by Stimack, it certainly complicates matters. Here's another one that's probably even more dramatic. This is, by the way, this is available for $7,500 from anseladamsshop.com. The spectacular image lives on. All right. So there are at least a couple of historical complications at work here. And the first has to do with the principle of inversion in photography and the motivation to suppress or acknowledge it. Because photography, of course, has been about inversion from the start. A century before Adams made his Wagnerian depictions of Old Faithful, one of the inventors of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot of England, was perfecting his paper process. And one of the things Talbot noticed is that and he noticed it right away, that when he made a photograph in his paper process, it inverted the world in two ways. Left to right was inverted, but also dark things became light and light things became dark. But he found, by virtue of using paper as his support for the print, that he was able to expose a second piece of sensitized paper underneath it, expose it to light, and re-reverse everything to get it the way he wanted it. And his friend Herschel called this one the negative and this one the positive, and that was the nomenclature that stuck from then on. So the inversion of the world is deeply embedded in photography, and that form of inversion, right, that production, the material production of inversion is something that's very much suppressed in the Sierra Club photographs, and it's replaced by this natural kind of reproduction of the mountain. And one of the things I was thinking of in the wake of, or even while Joanna was speaking, was the extent to which one can read this as a kind of extra humanization of photography insofar as photography is partaking of this natural principle. But on the other hand, one can read it as a kind of ideological whitewashing, right? I mean, one of the problems I have with the spectacular image is that all the years that people were using Kodak papers to produce these images, Kodak was perennially at the top or near the top of industrial polluters in the U.S. And this, you know, and by the way, that, you know, that relationship of, in some sense, disavowing the production extends to a lot of other work, right? If, you know, Andy Goldsworthy, right? He makes those beautiful, you know, constructions out in nature, but how do those get disseminated? They generally get disseminated in big books, you know, right? Which, you know, aren't being made out in nature and melting and, you know, washing away in a stream. Or if they're washing away in a stream, it's not good. So this, you know, this aspect of the spectacular image remains a problem. But this isn't always suppressed, right? And one reason that someone wouldn't want to suppress it has to do with establishing the agency of the photographer as the maker of the picture, right? And one of the things that established Ansel Adams as Ansel Adams was his utter mastery over the image, right? He could make light things dark, he could make dark things light, he could make day night, he could make night day, right? And so this, right, this kind of inversion was a statement about his mastery over the medium. And this is not something that goes into the calendars. This image would never appear in the calendar, right? So it's reading back into this history. And Adams has a model for this, and that's Alfred Stieglitz, who did this with the equivalents, where there are these glowing orbs, and you don't know whether it's the moon or the sun, and clouds are light, clouds are dark, and just playing with that malleability of value in the photographs in a way that establishes the photographer as kind of virtuoso, right? Which of course is important, right, if you want to establish your agency because of this notion that in photography things represent themselves, right? That notion has to be defeated in some way by the practitioner who wants to establish kind of artistic authorship over the image. So this is one problem with the story of Stimac, that actually that inversion in some sense has a history, right, or it's a complication of the story I've given of the Stimac. On here, this is Ansel Adams at 100, right? Here's a poster that was created that is demonstrating, right? This is his mastery over Old Faithful. He can make it look any way he wants. But the other problem, I mean, it's interesting that Stimac says the geyser appeared more like an oil gusher than a natural wonder. Because I think that means Stimac doesn't know that these were natural national wonders, right? These tourists flock to see oil gushers. If you look at books for children printed in Europe about America in the early 20th century, this symbol appears all over the place, right? This is America, right? This is the symbol of America. And it's also about the entwinement of the sublime in nature and the sublime economy. That those two things folded into each other in many ways, right? In that sense, right, Old Faithful was, right, a natural steam engine for the age of steam, right? And a lot of the language that was used when people went to Old Faithful and marveled at the power of this dynamo was the same language that was being used when people went to see electrical generators and so forth. And so this, again, is a complication of this history. And I would say also, as one digs into the history of the Sierra Club's own use of images, and I suggested this by that this is dinosaur illustration, the history is more complicated than you might expect. And actually, even this is the American Earth, despite its absolutely off-putting title, and despite some of the horribly florid rhetoric of the book, is actually a much more complicated book than you might expect. So for example, here's this photograph of, that Adams took of this torrential waterfall, and next to it the text, which is by Nancy Newhall, who was a curator and writer and photographer. In all the centuries to come, always we must have water for dry land, rich earth beneath the plow, pasture for flocks and herds, fish in the seas and streams, and timber in the hills, right? Very pastoral, right? Yet never can man live by bread alone. Now in an age whose hopes are darkened by huge fears, an age frantic with speed, noise, complexity, an age constricted of crowds, collisions, of cities choked by smog and traffic, an image of greed, power, terror, an age when the closed mind, the starved eye, the empty heart, the brutal fist threaten all life upon this planet. What is the price of exaltation? And I read this about 5 times before I realized how deep the structural ambiguity of this thing was, right? That on the one hand, you have the sublime being called up in nature in the image, and yet the industrial, horrible sublime being called up in the text about the cities choked by smog and traffic. And then the incredible ambiguity of what is the price of exaltation, which both could mean what is the price of retaining the exaltation of nature against the forces of development, or what is the price of humankind exalting itself through its own powers, right, in terms of this industrial sublime. So there is a history in which this kind of inversion, this kind of play between the sublime in nature and the sublime powers of humankind has very much played itself out, which I think ultimately leads to a much more complicated reading of the STEM Act, which I still find a very compelling bit of contemporary art, in part because, number one, this notion of inversion obviously has the meteorological, right, connotation, right, of entrapment, which is enacted in this, right, and associated with smog and so forth, but also the way in which it brings this relationship between oil and vapor, right, which is so critical right now in terms of climate change, and it brings it into the visual, in this loop that seems to be endless, and we can't get out of in a way that I still find immensely compelling. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay, so can people hear me? Am I close enough to the mic? Okay, great. So what a wonderful pair of papers. It's almost as if the two of you spoke before and collaborated and decided to produce this wonderful dialogue. So I'm gonna begin the discussion section by pointing to 2 points of connection, or making 2 micro observations about the talks, which also link them to yesterday's conversation. And then I have 4, and I promise they're shortish questions/observations. And the speakers and the audience can feel free to take up these observations or questions or completely ignore them as you see fit. But this is just a way to begin to make the neurons fire and to let all of you think about questions that you might want to ask. So one of my micro observations has to do with Joanna's talk and her wonderful description of the science fiction novel, the title and author of which I've now forgotten, but I'll ask you to remind me because it should be on my reading list. But what the novel describes in terms of this post-apocalyptic moment is a stratified society, if I'm understanding you correctly, where a rarefied climate-controlled environment is produced by virtue of the labor of a separate environment that contains the workers, the labor, the fumes, etc. And this reminded me of what Reinhold Martin discussed yesterday in terms of air as a spatial hierarchy, in the sense, or for those of you who weren't here, and he should probably recap this instead of me, but he described the LEED certification, so the sustainability certification of the Bank of America building in New York, and the incredible and monumental efforts of industry, labor, time, and so forth involved in producing an analogous rarefied, climate-controlled, pure atmosphere. And these struck me as analogs in the sense that they both pointed to air as a kind of spatial / class hierarchy, and also pointed to a pretty significant shift in how humans, or one might say human discourse, figures air. Because in the 19th century and into the 20th, it was the ocean of air. Air was the thing that connected humans globally. Air was the thing through which things could circulate, radio waves, telegraph wires. And it was spoken of up until and through the Second World War, and this was somewhat dystopian because, of course, aviation was a matter of surveilling and creating violence from the air with a global reach. But it's interesting that this notion of the ocean of air as the thing that connects has been or could be so monumentally reconfigured as a set of spaces disconnected from one another. So that's an observation. That was actually a longer observation than I meant it to be. The other observation that I want to make has to do with what Robin was saying about the spectacular imagery of the Sierra Club Sierra Club calendar photographs, all of which are burned into my brain because they hung in my kitchen as a child. And I'm sure my parents have versions of whatever your parents did somewhere stashed in their attic. And what you were saying about the absence of violence, droppings, detritus, rotting flesh, animosity, struck me as so closely parallel to natural history museum dioramas. And I've done this, and the students in the room who have been forced to do this with me, if you systematically look at the Natural History Museum in New York's dioramas, you see exactly the same thing. And it is aside from vultures attacking a quadruped of some sort, and I can't remember what it is, it might be a zebra, which is actually a really wonderfully or terrifyingly allegorical Christianized narrative. What you get is a bear eating a fish. That's the other moment of violence in those dioramas. And this got me thinking about spectacular image, but also the possibility of, and maybe we can talk about this, expanding the category of image that we're talking about today to apparatus, because those dioramas are apparatuses, and I wonder if it might be useful for us to push open that category of image and begin to think of things other than scrims or screens. Okay, so I'll try to make these 4 questions quick because you didn't come to hear me give a lecture. The first question I have, and I'm trying to bring some connective tissue in addition to the connective tissue that the 2 talks already produced. And this has to do with one of the bigger questions being addressed by this conference, which is the problem or the crisis of representation that has occurred in the face of climate change, right? And for the speakers today, this was figured rightly so because they were talking about photography as a crisis in photography in the face of climate change. The promise of photography was photography as a medium, as revelatory, surface penetrating, time freezing or time extracting, and I love the way you described the incision of time. And the crisis of photography speaks to or serves as a metonym for the crisis of imaging or picturing more generally. And I'm wondering if the crisis, and maybe this is something we can talk about, is a problem of picturing. That is to say, is the problem that climate change posits things that are unseeable that can't be made pictures out of? Or is it more or also a problem of temporality? And I'd like maybe to tease out the differences between picturing and temporality a little bit, because climate change, like deep time, is a temporal, durational phenomenon, and infinitesimally so. And so is the problem temporality, the deep time of climate change, but also photography's own variable temporalities, right? Or is this a problem of being? And this is something that yesterday and today's talks spoke to, because when Joanna was describing really wonderfully how the condition of life is a photographic condition, and I think I've butchered that somewhat, but and Robin described how photography is itself a form of life, and that things grow, as with geology, things grow into photographs. Is the problem of photography and picturing in the face of climate change a problem of being? Because what the speakers have said, raise questions like, what is life? What is an image? What isn't either of these things? If we can imagine a cell as something that produces in some manner or another a perception or a picture, where do we put the problem or locate the problem? I also wanted, and this has to do with temporality as well, I'm really curious about our own attachment to temporality and talking about our present condition. We are post-natural, we are post-human, we are after the human, we are after the spectacular image. And the notion of post and the notion of after, which is different from the notion of the non-human, the non-natural. I'm interested in how we're positing a moment that seems to challenge time and a sense of linear temporality, or challenge time as a human construct. I'm interested in the fact that we are so attached to producing a kind of temporally directional configuration of this moment. Two more very quick points, and this third point has in part to do with the fact that my mind is still being blown by listening to black holes on my iPhone this morning. For those of you who haven't checked the news on your iPhone, the LIGO antennae just detected the gravitational waves produced by two black holes colliding, and the result that registered here on terra firma was a chirp, to which I listened this morning. And this made me wonder about sound. We've been talking about images, but if the problem presented by climate change is a representational or a spectacular problem, but we're talking about life and embodiment and bodies that sense in multiple ways, might things like sound, the sonic, or even film, because everybody referenced in some way or another film, including the speakers yesterday, because film is in a sense photography plus time. And so I wonder if the image is a problem, what other formats, including the sonic, might we begin to think about or realize are the mediums by which we produce and gather knowledge. And I think I'll stop there, because what I'd like to do is open it up to questions. And as I said, I am more than happy to have you talk about the things I've just raised, or you can absolutely ignore them and ask questions of your own devising. Yes?
Thank you for that. I think that question around sort of being... Oh, okay. Thank you. The question that you raised about the kind of uneasiness with trying to find a kind of being in time, when kind of, the human time and geologic time are having this kind of collision, and geologic time has been the thing that human time has been defined against, or in various kinds of forms of opposition. And I kind of wanted to ask a question, I think it came very much in your talk, Joanna, about the way in which extinction is deployed as a kind of end of time, but it's sort of a very undifferentiated end of time. Yet what we know from kind of geology is that there's all sorts of survivals, there's all sorts of persistence in time, there's all sorts of ways in which extinction isn't a geologic diagram of these kind of like, strata that we kind of learn as a child to kind of figure geologic time. And so there's a way in which the Anthropocene is deployed in certain kind of discourses as a sort of sealing over of the future, this kind of, the thing that we can't pass or that life can't pass. And then there's a kind of reflection back on those moments or monuments of the kind of ruins of... So I wonder how we bring a kind of social and political differentiation into extinction, into a kind of the sort of being in time moments of extinction, if that makes sense.
Yes, I mean, let me just try and kind of pick up your question and relate to all the kind of very interesting things that Rachel has also commented on. And the idea, I mean, you're absolutely right around, that thinking around extinction always already brings up the question of kind of an extinction as a scientific fact for whom? Extinction of what? And as we know, apart from these kind of big extinctions that made their imprint in those layers, that are layers for us, that allow themselves to be read, there is also something that scientists call background extinction, which is an ongoing process. So extinctions happen now and again, as well as happening in between those moments of now and again that we recognize as spectacular. But also what the kind of question around cosmic time also ties into my bigger problem that I tried to formulate yesterday in that warped question around, what does it mean? Who is doing the rethinking? As in, what happens if we humans, we scholars in particular, kind of allow ourselves to zoom out into cosmic time? And then we kind of, what happens when we return from that trip? And we've seen something, we've unseen ourselves, we've positioned ourselves on a cosmic scale. We've understood extinction as a problem, but also we've also understood that extinction is often the survival of possibility of the possibility of our own survival. So in a way, we need the extinction of others for us to survive. Somebody else, has to die, and some other species have to die so that we can survive. And that kind of illustration of that extinction is not just a kind of scientific fact, but also a kind of process in which we actively participate, which we desire. It changes the narrative, changes our role and position in all of this. So I think it is very important to just analyze extinction as something for which we can take responsibility. And it's also a way of, again, cutting the Anthropocene and us in the Anthropocene to size. I'm less interested in kind of debunking the term because, there's lots of other terms. It's doing something at the moment. It's kind of circulating, but more in think, how do we not just use it as another term to enlarge ourselves and give ourselves those kind of vocabularies that still elevate us above other species. So, but at the same time, even if we want to take on board, and I very much do, together with the speakers from yesterday's panel, if we want to take on board or challenge human exceptionalism, I think it's a very important political ethical gesture to perform, then we can still retain a certain idea of human singularity. Now, human singularity is not the same thing as human exceptionalism, because we could talk about microbe singularity, we could talk about bird singularity, and then even within that we can make cuts and incisions, and maybe it stops being just human singularity but becomes much more historical, much more intersectional, so the relations get complicated. But obviously then we return to the question of doing certain kinds of scholarship, for example, once we've seen ourselves in the Anthropocene, have cut ourselves to size, if you like, and what does it mean to see that extinction as something, in which we've placed ourselves. So the question of what does it mean, or which is another version of the, question, so what, favored by scholars. I think it's more than just kind of methodological or metaphysical navel-gazing. I think it's an important point of orientation for any of us who still want to continue to do kind of critical work scholarship and kind of image-making in the light of all those debates and things. So it's really zooming out into space and then coming back, realizing that the place we return to is not the same place anymore. And just as a kind of quick follow-up around the question of air, which is, I was very intrigued by what you were saying around air, and how air becomes a space, but also becomes a problem, and how we see certain things and position ourselves in the world with air being invisible and yet also being a certain orientation space we inhabit. And I think photography and light are interesting because they visualize air to us also as space, as dimension, as something that is material rather than just ethereal. And we see that materiality precisely through different forms of pollution, through different forms of dust, different forms of matter that are kind of in the space. And that also, the last point around kind of what photography does, it's very much, I think Robin Stoke was so exciting for me because he foregrounded that since its inception, photography didn't have these representational ambitions, was already a translation. It was only maybe in the later moments when technology allowed for a certain kind of verisimilitude that photography forgot about it being a translation, it being already a process of enacting something, rather than just showing us the world as it is on our iPhones or on the kind of nature calendars. But that very moment of inversion, which very much, photographs arrive to us as sepia or as black and white, were very much precisely those moments of not trying to represent, but trying to invent, to create something, and to see air and light in some way. I think it opens up a different way of thinking about non-representationalism.
I completely agree with that, if I can speak. I mean, literally, if I can speak.
Do you have a water?
I do have
Okay.
I do have a water. One thing I didn't mention when I showed that that lantern slide of the Stieglitz with the asphalt paving is that it was a very deliberate decision on his part to exhibit those as projected lantern slides. And of course, one of the things, if you remember old projectors, is the way that the dust particles would dance about, right? So the radiance on the screen was kind of matched with a materialization of air, right, in the moment of projection, which I think was very deliberate.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Have you already passed the microphone around? Go ahead. No, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I thought both talks were just brilliantly provocative and intriguing. And it seemed to me that both of them take shape around a kind of hinged contradiction between, on the one hand, a crisis of hyper-spectacle, or what you could call supervision. On the one hand, we have this extraordinary technological capacity to see around the world with drones, with satellites, and yet we're being at the same time, living in a society of supervision under constant surveillance, CCTVs and so on. The other side of the hinge, I think both of you addressed brilliantly. You began, Joanna, with the notion of prohibition, and Robin talked wonderfully about the questions of invisibility, what we cannot see. 3 examples: the Gulf of Mexico, the greatest environmental catastrophe across 5 states. Photographs were prohibited, were criminalized, $40,000 fines for taking a photograph. Abu Ghraib for photographs. Currently there's a battle to make them visible. And I think those are directly actually connected to questions of climate change. And the gag laws. How do we make visible climate change when we're living in a state which is making the act of taking a video, taking photographs, calling people who do that, putting them on terrorist lists? And I think the hinge that or perhaps it's a question, the hinge that connects this contradiction between the hypervisible and the invisible, it seems to me, is the question of history. Is it possible to talk about these images and these photographs without returning them to historical memory? And is it possible to do that without raising the question, Rachel, you raised, of sound and other narratives? In other words, is there a risk of how do we evade the risk of falling under the seduction of spectacle while making the catastrophe of climate change perceptible and imaginable to a public without engaging the question of the politics of history?
That's a big question. Do you want to? I think it's a great question, and I think you're right. There's a sense now that everything is being recorded and distributed when it's definitely not. I mean, I once was on a local cable TV show talking about war photography, and I rode in a taxi back with somebody who was at the JFK school who was a retired admiral or something, and he said, after Vietnam, we learned our lesson. You keep those cameras away. And he was just so blunt about it. It was kind of refreshing. It was like, yeah. So the embedding, we all know, is the opposite, right? So I think that's a really good issue, and I like tying in the issue of what forms of visibility are allowed versus something which feels more like a basic material issue of how visible is climate change and the problem of visualization when you're talking about issues of causality, which photography's never been very good at. Photography is really about effects. It's really not, you know, it's got its own causal dimensions to it that are, you know, endlessly interesting. But as a representational form, it's a struggle. And I think, you know, I also think this issue of other senses, you know, sound as well. I mean, we're incredibly oriented around the visual, right? And Frederick Douglass said that what distinguishes us as human beings actually is not literacy, it's pictures. And which is interesting in a way, because it's interesting to make the post-human argument when, according to Douglass's formulation, we've never been more human, right? We've never been more productive of and consumed with images, right? With pictures. So you know, when environmental issues involving sound, it seems to me, are incredibly sidelined. I mean, you know, there's been stuff on naval sonar, but that's just, if, you know, the more you know about that, the more just unbelievable it is that we allow that to happen. And then, I forget the fellow's name who was trying to get 1 square foot of land in the US where there wouldn't be any human noise, and you can't do it because of planes. So he tried, and I think it was Olympic National Park, he tried to convince the FAA to, you know, leave one, you know, and it was you know, a wonderful quixotic kind of fight about it. But the propagation of sound, right, and the relationship between sound and air, right, is, you know, I think is super interesting from an environmental point of view. That's kind of a rambling answer, but it's a tough question.
Just as a
I'm sorry, Joanna.
Sorry, just as a quick follow-up, because I mean it is a cracking question in the sense that I think it also very strongly articulated what is kind of, I think, lies at the bottom of what I'm trying to do with this project, which is precisely a certain supposed or presupposed omnipotence of vision working across scales. On the one hand, we've got all these kind of bird's eye view images or cosmic eye view images. On the other hand, we've got the penetration of the body and other kind of organs on the cellular level. So you can see, and it creates a certain illusion of penetrability and visibility, while at the same time, what I'm interested in, and that's why I think I work with images as well, I think you're absolutely right that there are other forms of experiencing the world, the universe, that are not visual. But visibility to me is interesting precisely because of the promises it creates, and it doesn't deliver, which is also a question of the politics of the promise, of what it, you know, that the absolute visibility is supposed to give us something, to open us up to things. But the more we see, in a way, the less we know. And the creation of kind of big data, the access to all sorts of, you know, different bits of information, creates an illusion of kind of moving us on towards a certain notion of truth, articulation around that. So I'm almost interested in what's being occluded in those excessive forms of representation. It's like now we suppose that you know what space looks like, and yet, as Elizabeth Kessler beautifully shows in her book on the Hubble Space Telescope, we don't know what space looks like because what we receive are digits from cameras and computers. And what happens is that scientists then decided to translate those digits into versions of American landscape and to make it look like the 19th century sublime, so that the public could buy into the idea of kind of sponsorship for NASA, because otherwise space travel is too expensive. But if people see it and it looks a bit like heaven, those who want to see heaven, or it's a bit like a beautiful painting you've got on your, you know, over your mantelpiece, suddenly you think, okay, I'm going for it. So this is what space looks like, except it doesn't. But now we kind of know what space sounds like, but only because we've constructed devices that create space for our sound for us humans in a certain way. So now we don't know what it looks like, we don't know what it sounds like. But do we know what other things that are closer to home really look like? And what are the parameters, the frameworks through which we perceive? And why is it still possible to see or not see something? And extinction or the Anthropocene are those two scientific facts that it's possible to see and not see at the same time. So.
If I can tag on just one historical footnote to that, it seems to me that one kind of key moment in which that the failure of a kind of panoptic vision to account for the reality of its construction is the blue marble 1972 NASA photograph, which was actually inverted because south was up in the original photograph, and heaven forbid that south be up, right? So they turned the photograph upside down. So there was an inversion that was entirely, you know, predicated on certain, not at all innocent conventions, right, of representing the world.
Yes, he has the microphone, so. And then when you're done, if you could pass it to this person in the front who had her hand up.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentations. I have a question about the what I thought you were, Joanna, trying to get at in terms of the political promise of ruin lust photography. But I have a comment before I pose the question. So I was struck by the resonance and also some of the tension between the two presentations, which I took as both being about a certain kind of post-apocalyptic, post-human imaginary developed through photography. In Robin's version, looking at Sierra Club calendar images, was a kind of happy post-apocalypse in some ways, in a simplistic way, which you really, I think, importantly and provocatively problematized. And in Joanna's, it was a very melancholy post-apocalyptic imagery. So I'm curious about the potential tension there, because I think in Robin's, as you brought out in your reading, this is really problematic, and there's little political purchase to be gained through this type of imagery. Whereas in Joanna's, you attempted to somehow elicit a generative property within this kind of catastrophic imagery. I'm curious about this. It reminds me of an earlier debate in relationship to the claims of deep ecology in the 70s, where deep ecologists like Arne Næss would have been very supportive in some ways of both versions of a post-apocalypse which removed human presence from the planet. People like Murray Bookchin, coming from social ecology, was very critical of that version, claiming that it was ultimately a kind of misanthropic reading of ecology. And I think that, in a way, ends up suggesting yet another term aside from the Anthropocene, and which would be something like the misanthropocene, which I think we get in both of the readings here, a kind of rejection or a complete evacuation of the human that has a certain political potential. But in terms of that misanthropic dimension, I'm wondering how I'm wondering about the political economy of catastrophism, which generally I think if we listen to people like Eddie Yuen in an edited volume where he deals with that political economy, catastrophism is deeply debilitating politically, and it tends to support very conservative relations to a fatalistic escapism. So I don't know how. I'm wondering, coming back to my question then, Joanna, how you see where you see the political potential in catastrophism.
Well, thank you for that question, because the book I kind of did recently, The Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene, arose precisely as an attempt to respond to the Jeremiads of all sorts, which I tried to inscribe within what I called the masculinist tradition of kind of reasoning around the end of the world. And I also tried to reflect on the fact that we humans have been telling ourselves stories of our own apocalypse ever since we developed the ability to tell stories. So that kind of wallowing, not just in images of ruin porn, but of our own, be it extinction or disappearance, or kind of end of the world, in all the kind of major world religions and other kind of narratives, epics that we've been constructing, is something that is of interest to me. But there is also this kind of pleasure, and I was building on a little book by Steve Emmett, who is he was a professor at Oxford, but he was also kind of one of the major research guys, I think, at Microsoft. He's got this book called 10 Million, and he's got this very elaborate story about we're all going to die, and the world is coming to an end. And then he announces this really scientific conclusion, and I'm citing, which is, we are fucked. And then he just pronounces that and says, oh, this is it. And there's this tone, and there's a certain vulgarity around this narrative, not just in language, but much more on the conceptual level, that there is a certain mobilization of the story of our own end, pronounced with a certain there's nothing to be done, this is it, yet which still enlarges that kind of human, or often man, this kind of new age Jeremiah who takes upon himself to pronounce all of that. So I'm very much, and it's debilitating politically, but also it's extremely narcissistic. And so I'm trying to kind of work through these narratives and think, and little book I did called Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene, and the book itself is very minimal, was precisely an attempt to think, how can we think about these kinds of narratives now without inscribing ourselves into those kind of stories that offer no political hope, no kind of opening, and that at the end of the day don't address the very narcissism of the storyteller or their historical locatedness in that, because we are not just floating, particles floating in space. We are also historically located, and as soon as we are telling a story, we're telling it from somewhere, and there is a danger of telling that kind of. And so the work with images is also precisely, and my own kind of visual project where I'm developing alongside, it's also an attempt to poke fun a little bit at some of those stories and the way they are. And I think there is a very strong correspondence between the two sets of images that we have, because they are really kind of parts of the same coin. And it's only because traditionally visuality designated one set of those as pleasurable or the other one as kind of disturbing. But in that moment of transition, now we are looking at the 70s images of kind of, beautiful fields without any humans, and they look as chilling as pictures of the Detroit, say. So.
Yeah. It's that old pop song, is this the beginning or is this the end? I think there's been a kind of inversion on that.
Did you still have a question here in the front?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I think it's actually somewhat related to the last question. So in thinking about photography as a means to promote activism about climate change, I'm intrigued by your discussion of how we view classical ruins as tranquil and beautiful, but more current destruction is aesthetically pleasing in a way still, but melancholy. And I'm wondering if there's something really fundamentally different between those two types of pictures, or if, say, we start seeing tons of images of destruction type things meant to represent climate change, if we're just going to kind of get used to this aesthetic and think it's beautiful and it won't make us want to go out there and reduce our carbon emissions. And in my mind, I, of course, have, on Facebook where someone posts some article about something atrocious that happens and you like it and you feel better about what you've done, but nothing fundamental has changed. So I'm wondering if you see any ways to combat that from happening, or if this is just inevitable. I should also add that I'm a climate scientist, so this is not my area of expertise, but I'm curious.
I'm kind of a little doubtful as to kind of images changing behavior, as in, so I don't really know about whether it is actually possible to create images that would go and make people do something. And I suppose my own interests are less about that. But I think you're absolutely right that maybe there isn't anything ontologically different about these images from the past. We've just become more used to them. But I think the way, as you've articulated, I think very strongly now, that we are getting used to even these new images of the ruin. And they are also already, especially with people like Andreas Gursky or Edward Burtynsky, you see these they are these beautifully printed, lush images, and you are kind of supposed to look at them and feel compelled to make the world better. But is it really happening? So many people watched Al Gore's and Inconvenient Truth, and what's happened? People have watched it. So in a way, the role of media more broadly, or visualization, let's say even like scientific visualization of climate change, is kind of, the humans have this interesting ability to hold to on incompatible truths as part of their cognitive apparatus. Like you see something and you unsee it at the very moment. You accommodate the strangeness of the image. And it's just, so that in itself is intriguing for me. And I suppose I'm more interested in doing that rather than thinking or believing even that some sorts of images will suddenly cause activism. I do believe in activism. I think activism is important. And I think some of the interventions that TJ talked about last night are very strongly showing how you can do it. But maybe it's about less visual art and art that creates some kind of eruption, incision, break into a certain setup, be it a VW salon or something else. Maybe that's the kind of thing.
I think we have time for two more questions, and Eben and Natalie have had their hands up for quite a while, so those I'm designating those as the final two questions. There will be multiple opportunities for more conversation and dialogue as the day proceeds.
I think our side of the room gets all the love right now.
I was looking, no one had a hand up. Sorry.
So back on the issue of extinction, I'm with you that our life is contingent on the death of others, but I guess I would like to think that more in terms of ongoing relations of reciprocal capture, where mutual use and mutual exploitation sort of result in maybe these intergenerational life-sustaining entanglements. And thinking about extinctions, which are these events that can't be reversed, I guess my question back to you is, like, are you saying that we just simply can't control our technology or our political and economic systems or our industrial assemblages that are creating these extinctions in multi-species worlds? Is there something about the anthropos, this sort of being somewhere between the divine and the bestial, that can't control these sort of paraselves or extensions of ourselves that are doing things in the world that are causing these extinctions? Or is our species, is our existence as a species imaginable without those ongoing cascading chains of death in a final kind of way?
I think it probably isn't, and I'm not a scientist, but I think I'm a reader of science, and I would like to believe that what science is telling us about these kind of processes has a lot of kind of veracity to it, and so I think it's difficult to imagine our life without looking at these bigger cycles. And the answer would be that I think there are things we can control and things we can't control. So it does make sense to raise questions about bigger issues we can't control, like the meteorite that might come and wipe us all out. And scientists might be able to map it at the moment or see it coming, but they still can't stop it, presumably. And there's lots of other things that might occur. I mean, we can't control tsunamis. We might contribute to some of them. So I think there are other things we can control. We can control, temperature somewhere. We can contain oil spills. We can not lead to oil spills. So the answer is probably yes and no. And what some of these debate around the Anthropocene is doing is still, it's opening up a certain question of human hubris around that we can do everything, but it's also challenging this, like, oh no, it's too late, we've already messed up, we can't do it. So the answer is probably yes and no, and seeing ourselves as part of these processes and returning to that kind of human cut to size, if you like, and then still thinking, well, what do we do? What is our ethical responsibility and historically situated political responsibility?
Okay, I'll slip in another question that I think reiterates the other questions, but I'm particularly interested in hearing your response to the dual analysis of agency that you both did, and the focus in the agent who takes a photograph, that I think is really novel and important, because, of course, I think the Anthropocene as a concept is asking us, or demanding, that we recognize our agency in producing the world, our crisis of agency in not knowing what to do, or if we can do, or what we can do, and this idea of how our agency is kind of represented and misrepresented through, my own personal war against the Sierra Club calendars for 20 years in trying to reduce that imagistic, erasure of any capacity to productively interact with our, and take responsibility. I think this question that you were both arguing for, how our agency has been kind of manipulated through these imagistic technologies, and where, for instance, in the ruins, with the focus on the agent who is taking the image and how they're taking the image, but not the agents who have produced the actual structures that we are seeing, and where we focus, what is our response, what is our responsibility, our ability to respond as agents, which I think you both really framed, that this is actually the medium that is being manipulated, is the agency of those producing the image, who is responding to those images, who has the responsibility to those images, that I think is really critically important in understanding that we are agents and that we have the capacity to act, and
and that those actions can be accountable to the kind of desirable future, as opposed to this already, detonated apocalyptic visions that we must defy, and the political imperative that we will and are and can.
I think that's a great question, and for my part, I think, there's a number of thoughts I have. One is that I think it's important, at least for me, to recognize that this problem of agency is really a problem as old as modernity, in some sense, right? That I tend not to see us entering this new moment of crisis around our agency. We are recognizing the effects of ourselves as agents, but it seems to me that that in the early 19th century, at least as I've read it, there's a tremendous crisis that we've just never gotten over about ourselves as agents. And one of the things I love about Greg Stimack's work, because I completely agree, I mean, in some sense, part of our problem is we love images so much that we try to do our work in the world in the image. But that is only image work, right? And when we're in the image world, we're not attending to the infrastructure that produces that image. We tend, not to be engaged with, in any constructive fashion, all the rare earth mining and everything else that's going into our looking at that computer screen. And one of the things I love about the Greg Stimack loop is that while it is doing work in the image world, when I look at it, am reminded constantly in that loop about what that image world is, what kind of loop it is, right? And so for me, there's actually a very constructive relationship between work like that and the kind of work that TJ was talking about yesterday. Actually, I don't see them really in opposition. I actually see them working in a certain kind of concert. The other thing that I would say about agency, and that I felt very strongly in listening last night, is, for me, grappling with this moment and our agency requires acknowledging our ambivalence about the conditions of nature. I mean, and I think part of what I see in those, I mean, it's easy to lampoon those Sierra Club calendar images, right? But another way to think about them is a deep ambivalence about our being in nature, both for nature's sake, but also for our sake, which is the more suppressed part. When Reinhold said last night, I don't feel, what was it? Part of nature, natural. And you didn't mean post-natural, you just, right. which I think was a very important distinction. There's part of me that would sign on to that too, right? And it's, if I'm not willing to do that, I think I start to fall into a kind of image that I don't want to fall into, a very romantic image, right? That doesn't acknowledge, there's things about living under the conditions of nature that I find really intolerable. I mean, so for me, part of it is going back to that. There's a reason why, in the tradition out of which I came, that we once thought that there was a better place, right? I mean, I get that. Like, I'm not voting with the Christian right, but I get the dream of a better place, because I'm not thrilled about disease and, the contingencies we face and all that. So for me, part of it is, and I'm a total nature lover, backpacker, canoer, blah, blah, blah. That's why I had those calendars growing up, right? I mean, but I, for me, part of struggling with that agency and struggling with photography as a way of mediating problems of agency, for me, requires dealing with that ambivalence. And the essay that I contributed to one of the volumes that Rachel edited was called Landscape as Not Belonging, right? That in some sense, the lie of landscape is that we get to imagine that we wish we belonged. And in fact, what we're actually doing in loving landscape is precisely imagining that we don't belong, that we belong outside, and we get to just take it as an image, right? So anyway, long-winded answer, but I love the question.
I'll just add very briefly, because your question kind of beautifully encapsulated what lies at the heart of the project I'm trying to do. And the paper I presented today is part of this book on non-human photography I'm just finishing. And when I first pitched it to my publisher, which is kind of MIT, and first they said, all right, so you're just going to look at Google Street View and Hubble and things. And I said, well, yes, and at everything else. And trying to argue that, you know, photography, all photography is non-human. I'm saying, like, look at people's wedding photographs, or look at people's feeds on Instagram, and why there is a certain, what Flusser calls algorithmic logic to all events, to all photographs. Why do certain types of photographs get most likes on Instagram and others don't? So what I'm interested in is that dimension of the algorithmic logic in culture that runs kind of beyond just those images seen by the non-human eye, either up in the sky or deep down. But then, also working with Flusser, I'm returning to what you articulated as that kind of possibility of the reclaiming this diminished human agency within that. Flusser calls it this kind of role of envisioners or inframers, people who frame the world otherwise. And, you know, as pretentious and modernist as it sounds, it could be artists, could be academics, could be writers, could be activists, could be others, be those who take it upon themselves to stop and reflect on the moment, or the algorithmic moment in culture in which we reproduce certain kinds of images and ideas, and perhaps shift that. So it's not to reject that idea that there is a bigger kind of agency or technological agency at work in other things, but also to then return to us and thinking, how can we then shift that, work within those parameters? Can I make my Instagram feed look different? I'm not even on Instagram, but that's an example.
Well, I think now that we all have in mind feet on Instagram, I think it's a good time for lunch.
Yeah.
But you know, in all seriousness, please join me in thanking our speakers for a really terrific presentation.
So just a moment of housekeeping. You know, we started a little late with these projector complications, and we're sort of less pressured at the end. So we're going to break now. It's 12 o'clock. We're going to break for lunch. Lunch is provided to everyone, right? Please join us just outside the doors. We'll come back here at 1, and hopefully that'll give time for the projector to sort of rekindle itself and proceed from there. So thank you for your flexibility as we proceed through the day, and thank you for being here. We'll see you at lunch.